All right.
Well, yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeremy Pickens with Alabama Extension, and I'm joined with my co-host Bob Hockmuth from University of Florida, IFAS. And today's presentation is with Kevin Athearn. He's also with IFAS, and he's going to be talking about the economics with hydroponics. It's a really important topic. It can talk people in or out of it with this information. So with that, I'll leave it with you, Kevin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to try to share my screen now. How does that look? Can everyone see this, the full slide
Full slide.
screen?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to present today. I'm a regional specialized extension agent here in North Florida. And, there were several years there where I focused pretty heavily on hydroponics and doing some projects related to working with Bob Hockmuth here and Wanda Laughlin with the demonstration greenhouses we have here doing programs and was fortunate to get funding through a specialty crop block grant to kind of dig into the economics more on these protected vegetable systems. So that was a few years back. I haven't done a lot with it since then, but I think most of the takeaways should still be relevant. And so with that little bit of background, in the next half hour or so, I just wanted to talk a little bit about protected ag trends, then look at some of those economic cost and return studies that we did, and then hopefully have some good discussions. I'm an extension agent and you all are extension agents, and thinking about how do we work with our clients that are interested in doing protected ag or already doing protected ag, especially when it comes to the marketing and the economic side of things. All right, so just wanted to, looking at some of the data on trends, kind of that's one indication of, is it successful? Can it be successful growing vegetables and herbs and greenhouses and high tunnels? And what we've seen looking at USDA data for the whole United States, we see a really significant increase in the number of farms that report growing vegetables and herbs under protection. And my understanding is that they are only counting farms that are growing. They're not counting greenhouse nurseries. They're not counting field crops that maybe have protected row covers for part of the year. They're counting essentially crops that are permanently or always under a high tunnel or a shade structure or a greenhouse or indoors. One thing that's interesting looking at this data, besides the significant increase over the years, is that the majority of farms are growing tomatoes under protection. So that is by far the most popular crop, although we do see that the green part of the bars are other vegetables and herbs, and we see that increasing as well. And then looking at the acreage, the first slide was the number of farms. This slide shows the acreage. We see a similar increase from 2007 to 2022. Again, tomatoes is the majority of the acreage, but it's becoming more and more balanced, where we see the other vegetables and herbs growing at a faster rate. And now, as of 2022, just about as much acreage is in those other vegetables and herbs as we see in tomatoes. So what might account for this increase, the growth in protected ag? And I kind of just identify, a few bullets here in terms of some of the advantages. One is that you typically can get higher yields per acre, so it's land efficient, certainly in a high land cost environment. That might throw some advantages toward growing under protection to get higher yields per acre. And then we also have the opportunity for season extension with these systems, and that can both increase your yield on an annual basis, right? If you're growing for a longer period of time, you're going to be able to hopefully harvest more per year than you would if you were growing in the open field. But along with that season extension comes, in some cases, price advantages. Because perishable crops in particular do go through some seasonal patterns in terms of their price. To the extent that you can have fresh produce available of tomatoes or peppers or lettuce, leafy greens, whatever it is, cucumbers, when there's not as much supply on the market, you often can gain price advantages that way. With the amount of international trade that we have and a lot of produce imports, those price fluctuations are not as pronounced as they used to be. So maybe there's not necessarily as much, in terms of opportunity based on those seasonal market fluctuations, but oftentimes you still see at least a little bit of that. Also, product quality and consistency. My understanding is that some crops, it's hard to grow well, get good quality product out of growing in the open field. But if you have some sort of protection, whether it's shade structure, high tunnel, greenhouse, that will let you produce a more consistent, high quality product. And I've heard some buyers, some large scale buyers, restaurant chains, for example, say that they have moved or are moving almost entirely toward purchasing tomatoes, for example, that are grown under protection because they just feel like they can get a more consistent, good product from those sources. And then, of course, one of the advantages is reducing risks from bad weather, whether it's freezes, frosts, um, heavy rain events, things like that, as well as less pest pressure, and offers the potential to use less water and pesticides. But of course, there are some downsides as well, and that's primarily because of higher production costs. Protected systems generally have higher costs, and those are due primarily to the capital investment needed for the structure itself, or sometimes for those environmental controls and the equipment that go along with it, as well as the energy use. Of course, if you're just using a shade structure or a high tunnel, you don't have that added energy cost. But if you are growing in a fan and pad greenhouse, for example, or a totally indoor CEA controlled environment system, you're going to have significant energy costs associated with it. So I think, and one theme that's going to come up through my presentation and hopefully into our discussion is that, in thinking about whether protected ag makes sense and in what situations or what circumstances it does make sense, or for what crops does it make sense, and in what situation does it not make sense, I always think about that in terms of it only makes economic sense when the advantages of protected agriculture in terms of increased revenues outweigh the increased costs of these systems. And so, the question is always, well, is it profitable, or is this system profitable, or is this crop profitable or not? And it's difficult to answer, to give kind of a blanket or set answer to that question. Certainly, we see some crops are more suitable and more likely to be profitable in protected systems than others. So that's one thing we need to think about. But then we also need to think about the individual client that we're working with and what is their situation? What are their goals? What's their skill set? Where are they located? What type of market are they going after? What's the size of the market? And those factors will also determine whether they can do this profitably or not, right? So even if some people are being profitable growing leafy greens or tomatoes in protected systems, you may find other people that are not profitable with those same systems and same crops, because that does depend largely on these other factors in terms of their own skills, their own resources, their location, their marketing, and all that. And ultimately, we like to say it boils down to their competitive advantages, right? We live in a market-based system where people are competing in the marketplace, and the ones that succeed are the ones that have competitive advantages. And those competitive advantages can come from several different things. It could be your client or a business's human resources, skills, and technology that they are using or have access to. Um, and that ultimately leads to production efficiencies and gives them cost advantages where they can produce these crops at lower cost than per unit of output, lower cost per unit of output, and considering the quality of the output. And so you'll find some businesses that is their competitive advantage. I'm going to go out on a limb though and say that probably most of you are dealing with smaller farmers on these systems, and that when you're smaller, it's harder to achieve economies of scale and it's harder to be the lower cost producer. Maybe not impossible, but it's a lot harder. And so I would say, especially for the smaller farms, but not always, some of the larger ones too, a lot of that competitive advantage comes on the marketing side, right? So it could be your proximity to a high value market. It could be your market connections and relationships that not everybody else has. And you're using those market connections and relationships to help you with the marketing and give you an advantage. And along with that, those market advantages, some of that is due to your product quality and differentiation, right? You're not just selling tomatoes, you're not just selling lettuce, you are selling a high value tomato or high value lettuce, and that value may come from various things, and some of it may be perceived value, right? Ultimately, you're really just concerned with your customers, your buyers' perception of whether, for one reason or another, your products have more value or not. And that could be that it's just a really good, fresh, good tasting, product that could be one source of more value. But it could be also perception, right? If it's locally grown, some people may be more interested in purchasing from you and not somebody else. If it's locally grown, maybe they know your farm, they know your story, and things like that. Those are sources of product differentiation and perceived quality as well. All right. Moving along, just mixing in a few photos from here, Wanda Laughlin, our greenhouse manager, some of the demonstrations she's done here with vertical towers and with lettuce and NFT systems. I'm sure you've probably seen some of these things from Wanda and Bob's presentations as well. My understanding is that NFT lettuce, commercial protected lettuce, the two main systems that we see are these NFT systems or floating or deep water culture systems that seem to be viable. All right, so switching gears a little bit here, I'm going to spend a little bit of time reviewing, summarizing kind of the economic study that we did a few years back with this specialty crop block grant. And so the first part of it was focused on the greenhouse, one of the greenhouses that we had here in Live Oak at the North Florida Research and Education Center, managed by Wanda. And I'll show some information related to that. But first, just some background on different structures. So again, I kind of think of three basic levels of structures. The first one at the bottom of this chart would be a simple shade structure that just has some shades cloth for the roof essentially, and that's it, and no sides, open on the sides, and that would be your lowest cost structure. So this provides some estimates obtained back in 2021 for structures between 1,400 and 8,700 square feet, and it's on a per square foot basis. So the shade structure was between 250 and 350 per square foot, including shipping and taxes. Then you add in a little bit more for the installation cost, and you get a total cost of $350 to $450 per square foot. If we go to a high tunnel with just with a single layer of greenhouse plastic, poly, and side curtains, a little bit more structure and material than the shade structure. Now we're looking at total costs, including installation, of about $550 to $950 per square foot. And then if we move up to a greenhouse, a climate controlled greenhouse with 2 layers of poly and an air layer in between, and heating and cooling systems in that greenhouse, in total, looking at installation costs, including installation costs and concrete and drainage system, now we're up in the neighborhood of $22 to up to maybe $42 per square foot. All right. And if we annualize those costs, right? Because now when we think about our production, we're usually thinking about it on an annual basis or a seasonal basis. And so if we annualize those costs that I just showed, for the initial installation cost, we can think about that as dirt or dirty. That stands for depreciation, interest, repairs, and taxes on that structure, property, tangible personal property tax, or regular property tax. That's another rabbit hole. All right. And so that annualized depreciation, interest, repair, and taxes per square foot, I'm looking at anywhere from about 50 cents per square foot for the shade structure up to about $2 to $3.50 per square foot for the greenhouse. And then if we add the energy cost associated with running that greenhouse system, we're adding another $1.30 to about $2 per square foot just for the energy cost. Okay, so I was a little bit premature before when I talked about the greenhouse study we did here in Live Oak with Wanda and Bob. And so I'm going to start focusing on that now. So that year, Wanda grew these specialty cocktail type cluster tomatoes, colored bell peppers, and mini cucumbers in a greenhouse that's about 1,100 square feet. So here are the details for that. It was the 2020-2021 growing season. Hydroponic, grown with perlite and Beto buckets. We were growing Mai Tai cocktail type cucumbers. One planting, they were transplanted in September, and then we harvested November through May. 3 different types of bell peppers. Also just one planting for the year in September. We harvested those from December through April. And then Wanda did 3 plantings of cucumbers, the Minar mini type cucumbers, transplanted in October, December, and April. And then we were able to harvest from those 3 plantings from November through May. And, I don't know how much background y'all have with these systems, but in general, in general, it's hard to grow crops in the summer in Florida, fruit and vegetable crops in general. And because of the high humidity, my understanding is that it's hard to get a lot of cooling in our greenhouses as well during the summer. So oftentimes we take the summer off. Although I don't know if you've heard from some of the earlier sessions or from Bob or Wanda that, they've done quite a
It
bit
becomes
with,
solution, Ashley. I'm sorry, I couldn't see you.
I'm not sure, was that a question? Or
I
just some
think somebody just accidentally didn't unmute.
unmuted? Okay, gotcha. So anyway, I don't want to go off too much of a tangent, but you may have heard about us growing lettuce, for example, through the summer, which may be counterintuitive because lettuce is I think of more of as a cooler crop, but with a chiller unit that keeps the water in the NFT system cool, that seems to be viable. But for this system, we planted in the late summer, early fall, and then wrapped things up in the late spring. All right, so looking at the economics of that particular system, now I lump together for the whole greenhouse those dirty costs, the depreciation, interest, repairs, taxes, and a bit for insurance, added in the energy cost, as well as the cost of a little transplant area within the greenhouse. and some general greenhouse supplies, and came up with $5.83 per square foot. If we factor in the labor costs, we tracked the labor that was put into these crops during the season, and came up with a total for the greenhouse of about $5 per square foot. You can see the other items here on the table: water and nutrient delivery, containers, pest management. And then, so a lot of that was treated together for the whole greenhouse, but then we did separate out some costs that were specific to the tomatoes, specific to the cucumber, specific to the peppers. Those were the seed cost and the transplant cost, and maybe a few other small things. Excuse me. All right, so that was the cost side. Now looking at the production or yield output side. We so liking, I like to convert things as much as possible to square foot or per plant position. The tomatoes were planted at a density of 3.44 square feet per plant. The peppers were 6.89 square feet per plant, and the cucumbers were about 3.75 square feet per plant. You can see the length of harvest in terms of the number of weeks here, ranging from 18 weeks for the cukes up to 27 weeks for the tomatoes. I think for the cucumbers, it was because there was a bit of a gap in between the three different plantings and the harvesting. That's why the weeks are less. The yield per plant position ranging from 8.72 to about 13 pounds per plant position. And then the yield per production square foot for the tomato and cucumbers were a little bit over 3 pounds per square foot of output. The pepper, we kind of had a bad year on the peppers that year, so this may not be, ideally a commercial product system would be getting more, I think, out of the peppers. But we just ran into some pest issues and ended up pulling them out a little bit early. Okay, moving right along, now trying to boil this all down to profitability of this particular system. We're showing here at the top of the table the marketed yield in terms of pounds per square foot. And then what about the market? Okay, so when we think about pricing and what price to assign a crop, we need to think about how this crop is going to be sold. Is it going to be sold directly to final consumers at a retail price? Is it going to be sold wholesale to a distributor or to a retailer? In which case the price you would expect to be significantly lower. Is this a specialty item that maybe is going to get a premium price or not? So I'd like to point out the prices here, they may look kind of high, but if you think about some of the premium tomato products, in particular those cocktail cluster type tomatoes, they may be sold in a clamshell at less than a pound for each clamshell. And so you might pay $4, $5, $6 just for that clamshell. And so, looking at the price data, it seemed reasonable that for a high-end tomato, high-end pepper, and high-end cucumber, which we are growing here in this protected greenhouse system, that we could get premium or good prices for those. And these prices shown here, $5.99 a pound, that was about average for the retail prices that I found looking around for this high-end type tomato, pepper, and cucumber. I feel like there was something else I wanted to mention on that, but right. Yeah, so thinking about scale, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too. This is where when you're working with clients and thinking about what is appropriate, and we talked about one system that may be viable or economically feasible for one person may not be viable or economically feasible for another. And a lot of that does depend on the market that they're going after, their marketing plan. So, to be able to sell direct to final consumers at retail price, you're probably going to be a pretty small operation, right? Because, if you think about it, to sell retail, this might be a farmer's market type situation or a farm store, farm stand type situation. you're going to be limited in terms of the amount that you can sell in your area at retail, direct to final consumer. And so if you're planning on, higher production volumes, higher production quantities, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to move that much product at these price points, right? You're going to be looking more at a lower wholesale price. So I just wanted to point that out. So anyway, we're putting these numbers together. We get sales revenue per square foot, and then using those the cost information I showed earlier on a square foot basis, but breaking out the labor, in this case, not including the labor cost, but including all other production costs that go into what we call COGS, cost of goods sold. And now we're looking at about $7 to $10 per square foot for cost of production, not including labor. So that gives these gross profit numbers per square foot, again, not including labor. Okay, but what if we bring the labor in? So again, we're thinking about a small scale system where it's likely that the owner manager is doing most of the labor himself or herself, because this is a fairly small system. And based on the labor hours that we tracked and dividing it up as best we could between the different crops, some crops being more labor intensive than others, tomato in particular requiring a little bit more labor. So I'm told from Wanda, ended up with 0.49 labor hours per square foot year, down to the peppers, which again, we pulled out a little bit earlier. So that was part of it. Only 0.21 labor hours per square foot year. And so putting those two numbers together, we calculate gross profit per hour, thinking that, okay, that's kind of a key measure. If I'm a small grower, maybe with one or two relatively small greenhouses, I want to know, how much money am I making for every hour that I'm spending in this greenhouse? And so these are the estimates that we came up with. $18.73 per hour for tomato, 16.81 for cucumbers, and only $1 per hour for the peppers. But again, that just happened to be a bad year for us for peppers. With any type of production budget or cost and return study, not only is every greenhouse going to be different, but every year is going to be different. So keep that in mind. I don't want you to take away from this presentation that, oh, tomatoes are always more profitable per hour than cucumbers, and cucumbers more profitable per hour for pepper. That's not, I would not encourage you to interpret it that way, but to think about some of the nuances and how come we came out with the numbers that we did in this particular greenhouse in this particular year. All right, so that was the kind of summary of the study that we did here at the North Florida Research and Education Center in Live Oak. Also for that project, we tried to track information on one participating farm in Claremont, Florida, that was growing high tunnel tomatoes in native soil and pretty much organically, I believe. And then another small demonstration over at our extension center in Hastings, where we were growing mini cucumbers in pots in a high tunnel. So again, neither of these systems are not fully climate controlled, or not as climate controlled as the greenhouse that we were using in Live Oak. These are lower cost systems, but less controlled systems. So again, this summarizes what I just mentioned. The one example was the tomatoes, slicer and cherry types in Claremont, Florida, transplanted in September, harvested November through May. And then the other system was cucumber, also the Minar mini type, same type we were growing here in Live Oak, but this time they were grown in a less controlled high tunnel and only 2 turns per year, a fall crop and a spring crop with a bit of a gap in the winter because of the cold weather and inability to really provide much heating in that simple high tunnel system. So what we ended up, notice the production square feet per plant is higher than what we had in Live Oak in the greenhouse. We were like between 3 and 3.5 square feet per plant here in the greenhouse in Live Oak. So we had a higher planting density in Live Oak, Whereas in these two demonstrations, the plants were spaced farther apart, having more square feet per plant, 7 or 8 square feet per plant. Shows the harvest weeks were a little bit similar, a little bit lower on the cucumber, I think. Again, because only 2 turns per year. This shows the yield per plant position, which was pretty good. I think comparable to what we got from the greenhouse. But when you convert it to a square foot basis, because the planting density was lower, now what were we? Let's go back, see if I can remember. Marketable yield per square foot, we were 3, right? A little bit more than 3 in terms of pounds per square foot. Whereas now our yield per square foot is only around 1 pound per square foot. Okay, so not getting as much production out of the high tunnel as we did out of the greenhouse. So, looking at that marketable yield, similar retail prices, we got the sales revenue per square foot. The cost information on these two systems, I feel like we did not have as detailed or as maybe as reliable cost information. So I say these were kind of ballpark estimates for production cost of goods sold at $3 per square foot for each of those systems. That gave us this gross profit of about $2 to $3 gross profit per square foot, not including labor. But now if we factor in labor, we also had less labor hours per square foot than we did in the greenhouse. Part of that, I think, is because we had fewer plants per square foot, right? Because of the lower planting density that translated to less labor per square foot. Also, I would say the labor information on these two systems probably was not as reliable as the information that we got here in Live Oak. So I'm just putting that out there that I think these numbers are pretty accurate, but not with as high confidence as I had for the numbers I showed for the greenhouse system. So interestingly now, even though the gross profit per square foot was lower, because the labor hours per square foot was also lower, the gross profit per hour came out pretty similar to what we saw from the greenhouse, right? In this example, we're getting about $15 to $19 per hour. I'm sorry. And so ultimately, I guess I would say it's not conclusive based on this one study, 1-year study, whether greenhouse tomato pepper cuke system is better from a financial standpoint than a high tunnel tomato or cucumber system or not, right? So it may depend more on some of the nuances of the marketing and the production efficiency, and the suitability for a particular grower, whether they feel like it's better to go with a high tunnel system, lower cost, but probably lower revenue, or a greenhouse system that's going to have certainly higher upfront cost, higher structure and fixed cost of maintaining that system, but ideally getting more revenue out of that. Yeah, so again, it kind of depends, I guess, would be my conclusion on which is better or to be recommended in a given situation. All right, so kind of moving towards the wrap up discussion, again, thinking about this idea of, for what crops are these protected systems feasible? When is it feasible to have a system with all the bells and whistles and all the expenses, and when is it maybe not? And I kind of put this together diagram thinking about on the left, you see the cost per square foot. Generally, the open field is going to be the lowest cost per square foot. Moving up in cost, we move up to a shade structure, high tunnel greenhouse with heating and cooling system. And the most expensive in terms of cost per square foot is going to be a fully indoor, fully climate and light controlled system. And then trying to think about it, well, again, remember this concept that I guess I would argue, looking at the left, it only makes sense to move up this ladder on the left in terms of cost per square foot if you think the additional value you get per square foot is going to move up even more, right? If on the right, if that additional value per square foot is going to outweigh that additional cost per square foot, then it makes sense to move up this ladder, right? This protected ag ladder. Otherwise, it doesn't, right? And if it may, so just throwing out some kind of crazy examples on the right, you see sorghum, this big, bulky open field crop that's highly mechanized for management. We're looking at a value of about 1 cent per square foot, and putting sorghum in a greenhouse, you know, you could do it, right? But you're going to certainly add a lot of costs, and maybe you could get 2 cents per square foot by doing it that way. But getting 1 additional cent per square foot value out of it is not going to outweigh your additional cost of putting sorghum in a protected system, right? That may seem like a stupid, crazy example, but hopefully it drives home the point. Um, and I guess moving from high tunnel, kind of going back to the examples I just showed, moving from a high tunnel to a greenhouse with heating and cooling systems added costs, but it also added some value. And based on those studies that we did that year, it wasn't clear whether the greenhouse always, the additional value from the greenhouse system always outweighed the additional costs or not. It was more like a fine line, could go either way. I guess I'm just going to, along with this slide, throw out one more example that maybe y'all can relate to. I was here at a field day or community day and had somebody come up and talk to me about protected ag systems. She somehow had just gotten a hold of or paid for or something, I don't know, inherited essentially a warehouse is what it sounded like, but it was going to be, she felt like it could be used for or converted to a fully indoor protected ag system, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, big expenses, right? We can't rely on free sunlight. We have to pay for all the lighting and the energy costs and all the climate controlled. And I, asked her what crops she was thinking of growing in there. And she mentioned, well, I was thinking about maybe collards or maybe some melons. And, right away I'm like, oh gosh, red flags coming up. It's possible maybe there's something I'm just not getting about what she's doing with this, but I'm thinking, okay, collards, they grow pretty darn well in the open field, not a super high value crop. Same with melons, take up a lot of room, you know, and so I guess the point I'm trying to make is, part of that with that conversation with her was that, okay, there's certain crops that you can get a lot of value out of by growing them indoors, growing them in a protected system, where now with that higher cost, that value you get out of it really, really could make sense economically. But then there are other crops like collards and melons and potatoes and carrots, things like that just are not going to make sense in these sorts of systems, um, because you're just not going to be able to get enough extra value out of them relative to what you could do in the field. All right, so this is my last slide, and I kind of was thinking about this as a segue into, well, kind of my last slide into discussion. So maybe I'm just going to run down these bullet points, give some acknowledgments, and then we can open up the floor to questions, discussion, that kind of thing. So I guess thinking about what my advice would be for extension agents who are working with clients who doing with these sorts of systems, growing vegetables in greenhouses or shade structures or high tunnels. First one is that a lot of times you get people that come to you that feel like you should have some kind of, or maybe I feel like they're looking for some kind of set blueprint, right? What's going to be the most profitable crop and the most profitable system? Can you just tell me what it is and I'll go off and make a lot of money growing whatever crop and system you tell me to? And so I would stress that there is no such thing as a set blueprint really that's going to fit every client in the same way. It really depends those crop and system choices depend so much on their particular marketing options, their marketing plan, their location. A lot of that has to do with proximity to markets or proximity to key inputs. Depends on their skills and resources, depends on the amount of money they have to invest in a system, because some of these systems can be quite a big, to reach a certain scale with a high cost system is probably out of reach for a lot of our clients. So, instead of thinking about, what is the answer to what's going to be the most profitable crop or system, we need to be talking with them about what's going to be the most suitable for them and where are they going to have competitive advantages? What is their competitive advantage going to be with one system versus another? And so that's really what the conversation needs to focus on. But of course, do consider that, some crops are appropriate for a greenhouse production system, but others really are not. And again, think about comparing that added value, moving up that protection ladder. As you increase your cost, moving up that protection ladder, are you increasing your value just as much, if not more? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to move up to a fully protected indoor controlled environment system. And then also to talk with them about sizing and cost that goes along with that sizing of the structure and equipment. So some of that sizing question has to do with their marketing plan, right? It may be obvious if they're selling at, a farmer's market or farm stand. They don't need a really big system that's going to produce a high volume because they're not going to be able to sell that much volume. And so they really need to be thinking about their marketing and what's reasonable and realistic for them to be able to sell. Or do they have some wholesale connections? They feel confident that they have some distributors or some retailers that are going to buy from them at a certain so many pallets or boxes every day or every week, and that they can, maybe achieve some economies of scale by having a larger system, and being able to meet that production volume. So again, just one last concept that I would stress related to this idea of size and volume is that certain costs are going to be what we call fixed, right? So generally your greenhouse structure and the equipment, the heating and cooling systems that go into the greenhouse structure are going to be fixed, meaning that it doesn't matter if I grow one tomato plant or 100,000 tomato plants in that structure, those costs are going to stay the same, right? You're still going to have to pay for the structure, the depreciation and interest on that structure. You're still going to have to pay to heat and cool the system. And this relates to the idea of economies of scale, which means that once you have costs that are fixed or what we call indivisible, the more you can produce, the lower are your costs per unit, right? So one simple way to explain, or one way to maybe think about extremes, is that if you pay $100,000 for a greenhouse setup, $100,000, and you only produce 1 pound of tomatoes from that structure, well, not even talking about the fertilizer and the seed cost and the transplant cost and all that. Just thinking about the structure and the heating and cooling costs. That's going to cost you $100,000 per pound, right? So obviously that's not going to be economical. Whereas if you can produce, and I didn't annualize that $100,000, just trying to keep it simple here. But if you produce 200,000 pounds of tomatoes out of that $100,000 greenhouse, now you're only looking at a cost of 50 cents per pound, right? For at least for that structure cost or whatever went into that fixed $100,000 cost. So the point is that if you invest a lot of money in some big system or a system with all the bells and whistles, you better hope that you're really generating a lot of volume out of that system in order to spread out those fixed costs, reduce those costs per unit, per pound of production, and achieve what we call economies of scale. All right, so I just wanted to acknowledge that that study that we did depend on a specialty crop block grant. The money came ultimately from USDA Ag Marketing Service, and we've had some sponsors that have been good to us over the years. Atlas Greenhouse, Signature Supply, Johnny Selected Seeds were three of them. And so that's all I have in terms of the presentation, but I'd be happy to have some discussion or take some question and answer.
Does anybody have any questions for Kevin? I've got one, Kevin. I don't know if I can articulate or if I've got my head wrapped around it very well, but something I was noticing when you were comparing the numbers from the system, and what Wanda was doing there at your station versus the high tunnel. And looking at the pictures, it looked like the high tunnel was smaller in width,
Mhm.
and so I just wonder how much that like picking the right size greenhouse, like if they had added 2 feet to the width of that high tunnel, they may have could have put an extra row, in
Yeah.
there, and that would have increased your plant density per square foot. And so I guess in doing that, your labor, I don't know how that affects your labor. I guess because it's per plant, but per square foot, your energy cost might be lower per square foot, I guess. I don't know. I don't really know like what I'm trying to articulate, but just something I picked up on. I don't know if you have any comments uh, about that.
Yeah, good observation and question. Unfortunately, I don't, and there may be others with, I'm sure there are others with on this with more expertise than me and in some of the details of these, of how best to grow tomatoes or cucumbers. But I guess what I wanted to say with that is that, we haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of research where we can break out and find, in detail this planting density versus this other planting density versus this other planting density that I'm aware of, or I'm not real up on research that has been done on that. So, in terms of the costs and returns, we were kind of just depending on these are the systems that we had access to. And we went with the planting density that Wanda usually uses in her greenhouse. And then we went with the density that this one participating farmer was using and the demonstration out in Hastings. So I guess I would say it wasn't part of the research design in terms of necessarily choosing density and trying to compare the planting
Right.
density. But I think you make a good point that if you're already paying for this structure and maybe for energy costs to heat and cool it, um, it certainly makes sense to try to optimize that density, right? To get as much production out of it as you can per square foot without running into problems where you're creating labor inefficiencies or more disease problems or something because of such a high density. But maybe others have thoughts or comments on that.
Um,
Yeah, I would just say that this has been one of the challenges for us in the research setting is that, to have a whole bunch of different replicated structures that are the same is really, really difficult. We're fortunate to have one or two of each of these. So I think the spirit of the question is that it's a very fair question. And then I think we're forced into the situation where we try to get every little bit of information we can, even though it's not perfect, because it's better than not having anything at all. It's just so hard to find information on these greenhouse hydroponic systems and so forth that I think we accept that weakness, but are happy to have anything at all.
oh yeah. I think it's great information, and it's really hard to compare apples to apples across different structures. But I guess my main thing I was trying to get across is picking the right size greenhouse if you're talking to a client, and maybe it's 30 foot wide versus 25 foot wide, and that extra 5 feet may give you an extra row just because of the way the greenhouse is shaped. And um, having that extra row in there might bring down your cost per square foot, I guess, because you have more plants in there. Now I don't know about your labor, because I guess your labor goes up because you have more to harvest. But I just
Yeah.
something I was looking at with that density, and the size of those structures. It looked like they had a lot less lower density of plants because the width only allowed them to have a certain amount of rows. But it looks like their profit was still pretty good. I mean, comparing the two
On a,
together.
at least on a per labor hour
Per
basis.
labor
Yeah.
hour. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Speaking of per labor hour, Dr. Kim asked, when you mention the labor profit per hour, how many personnel are covered?
Yeah. So we tracked person hours or man hours. So it didn't matter whether it was 3 people working 1 hour or one person working 3 hours, it comes out the same, right? So, but maybe, so I guess what I'm saying is it was all, everything that I showed was converted to like a per square foot basis per crop and then broken up per crop. But maybe where you're kind of thinking about it is, what was the total amount of labor for, a 1100 square foot greenhouse? And I don't off the top of my head remember. We could probably go back to the slides and calculate that out. If you look at the, maybe I think if I could just quickly see if I can pull up a number. Um, so looking at the system as a whole, yeah, that was converted to a dollar value. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think my recollection would be that like 11 or 1200 square foot high tunnel or greenhouse, you could certainly manage with one person working not even necessarily full time, but I forget how many hours per week that ended up being. Maybe Wanda will jump in about on that, but I think certainly the idea of this scale could be manageable by one person who puts in, several hours each week.
Kevin, you have any advice, or Bob or Wanda, when someone comes in and they're wanting to get into this, and they think they're going to basically make all their income, quit their job, or whatever, and with one greenhouse, uh, regardless of the crop. I mean, how do you guys normally handle those situations? Unless it's cannabis, that's a different crop.
Yeah,
You want me to input?
sure, Wanda, go
So
ahead.
if they come in and think they're gonna come in and easily make a profit off of one greenhouse and make it rich, then I come in and crush their dreams. Yeah, there's no, you just rip the Band-Aid off and tell them that there's a reality to it, and you're gonna put in a lot of effort, and you're gonna usually break even. Unless you have a really high-end crop that you've got a niche market for, you're not coming into it to get rich.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know that Wanda and Kevin and I have talked more people out of growing tomatoes, for instance, than we've talked into growing tomatoes. But I think one of the things that has been useful to me is that I would say, okay, let's think about this. You're going to have a standard greenhouse, and I'm just going to use for easy math that you're going to have 1,000 plants in that greenhouse, which is more than you would. But let's say you're going to have 1,000 plants and you get 20 pounds, per plant. And try to walk them through that to see that, okay, your gross income is just not very great. And so if you're looking at quitting your job and you're going to make, $10,000 net is what, almost a good scenario when it's all done, is that really what you want to do? And so I think taking a lot of Kevin's numbers that he's gone over today and try to at least boil down to the big picture and give him an idea that, hey, this is not going to work on a small greenhouse situation unless you're gonna grow a product that is very high value, and then you can redo the math. But especially tomatoes are really, really, really hard. So it's just a really hard crop to grow, and the deeper the south you go with pests and viruses and things like that. So yeah, I would agree that Wanda's a very delicate dream crusher.
Um,
See, Anna has her hand up.
Um, yes, thank you, Bob. So I'm an extension agent down here in Palm Beach County, and I had a chance to work with the large hydroponic growers and also some very small ones. And the smaller ones usually they need to diversify. They cannot just grow tomatoes or peppers, and then even among tomatoes, you have to have all sorts of different type of tomatoes to make a living at the end. And if you are a big growers, when I'm talking about big, that you can find their produce on the Publix or Walmart's shelf, they can do only lettuce, but even with the lettuce, they have to somewhat diversify. So when somebody comes to me and then they think that they can just start from zero, yeah, just like Bob said, and Wanda, it's not gonna work. The key, I think here is really just diversify, and then have that revenue at the beginning, and because that's always the next question, where I can find money to finance all these things from nothing.
Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead, Jeremy.
No, you just brought up a good point with the financing. I think that's one of the big hurdles. Banks are not really, from what I've seen, willing to do a lot of lending, because once you build a greenhouse, it's really hard to repo. It's basically worthless, and so that's been a big challenge for a lot of folks is finding that financing if needed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I agree. Good point. And good point, Anna. I think that gets back to the point about your situation and your market, your plan, and what your competitive advantage is. If you are large, you're really going for that economies of scale, production efficiency, and you can move a large volume of a single product. And so that's where it can be more efficient for them to just focus on doing one product like lettuce or tomato at a lower cost. So they can make money on that wholesale price, but then they're moving large volumes at that wholesale price. Whereas with a small grower, if you think about it again, gets back to the, what you can sell directly to local customers. And, you probably can't sell, I don't know, I'm trying to pull numbers out of the air here, 10,000 pounds of tomatoes a week, but you could sell 2,000 pounds of tomatoes and 2,000 pounds of cucumbers and 2,000 pounds of peppers and 2,000, right? When you have that limited direct market there, that diversification not only spreads out your risk, but it allows you to move more volume by diversifying into multiple different crops. And so their advantage is not on their production cost, but their advantage is on having a good quality product for people that want to buy maybe directly, and having a variety of different products that they can move that way.
Yeah, I think just to feed back that it's not all gloom and doom, that we do have lots of folks that are doing exactly what Anna and Kevin have just described, diversified. They're tucked in near an urban area where they can get a high price for their product. They are diversified, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things that they're offering. And yet they're not necessarily depending on that for their sole source of income. They're looking at that as a supplemental income on a small basis that a small family unit, 1 or 2, can handle. And that's, that if they're satisfied with that, that's where we see that, in my opinion, in my experience, the greatest level of success. And once they try to expand, then they need more help, but they're not willing to buy more or pay for more help. Then it goes downhill in a hurry because they've taken on too much, and now they hate what they're doing, and they're just not enjoying it. So that if they can find that sweet spot, something they can manage, a good bit of hours a week, but not be their sole source of income. Enjoy the market, enjoy the socializing with the customers and things like that. That's where, in my assessment, there's been the greatest level of success. So there is a sweet spot there, but it's tricky to find it, and each individual operation probably approaches it just a little differently.
Have you guys seen any? I mean, Florida has probably more small farms doing this than anywhere in the Southeast, and have you seen anybody doing this where it's almost treated, as like a loss leader, where maybe they're growing tomatoes in the winter, but they're using it to bring people over to buy their collards at the market, because it's sexy to have tomatoes in the winter? Or is there any situations like that, or anything, scenarios like that?
I don't think nothing comes to mind immediately where that's like it's almost too much work, too much money, too much to be a loss leader. If I understand the question right, yeah, it's not common, Jeremy. I'll put it that way.
Madeline has a question.
I was going to share, I'm down in Sumter County and I'm the horticulture agent. We have the Villages Grown, which is a hydroponic greenhouse, and the Villages is a large retirement community. They have approximately one greenhouse in production, but they use it to bring people in for tours, and then they sell them other produce as well that they might not have grown themselves, but they have the greenhouse and they show people a few things they do grow. So that's maybe an example of what you were asking for.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds similar. Yeah.
Or maybe something similar, but not exactly the same. But some of these smaller growers are big enough to have a farmers market on their place. So they invite sometimes other people, other producers that kind of complement what they can offer. So it's almost like they have a little bit of, I don't know, eggs, a little bit of tropical fruits from the neighbor producers, and then some of the vegetables that they produce. So they're like really, really small green market, but on their own farm, like once a week.
Jeremy, before we close it down entirely, I just want to thank Kevin for not only doing this particular program. He's just he has a very unique niche with a lot of information, obviously a lot of expertise. This kind of information that's been presented today is really hard to find, and it's good to be able to walk 20 yards down the hall to find the experts. So Kevin, thanks for continuing to do all this good stuff for the industry.
Oh, you're welcome, Bob. Thanks. I don't know if I'm happy to share my slides, and when you were talking about thinking about the greenhouse as a whole and how much labor for the whole greenhouse, we wrote a paper that was in the FSHS proceedings a few years back that has all that information, or at least just for the tomato part of it. So I'd be happy to share that too with anybody that's interested.
That'd be great. Yeah, we can email that out to the folks that registered. That'd be great. Well, like Bob said, Kevin, thank you so much. This has been great. It's really good information and the most important information. And thanks again, and appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.